Once again, welcome everyone to another Thursday evening session on our study of the book of First Corinthians. And we're busy with the pericope, chapter 6 from verses 12 to 20. Last week I gave us a little bit of an overview, both philosophically and theologically, and I compared some Stoic and Cynic ideas with some of the ideas that Paul may have derived from the Old Testament context and how he approaches this whole topic of sexual immorality. Now, last week I promised that I would go a little bit into the history and the context of potentially what is happening here, and I'd like to deliberate on that again tonight. So we're still in the same pericope. We're still going to be looking at verses 12 to 20. I'm probably going to be looking at verses 12 and 13 in a little bit more detail this evening. Just as a quick reminder, what I'd like to say is, when we look at verses 12 to 13, and let me just read them actually before I even get into the reminder. So the pericope heading there in the NASB translation, you can follow there again, top left of your screens. The body is the Lord's. And the NASB translation reads as follows. It says, "All things are permitted for me, but not all things are of benefit. All things are permitted for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. Food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food. However, God will do away with both of them. But the body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body." I'm not going to read any further than that this evening. As I said just now, as a quick reminder, in verses 12 to 13, we're dealing with a number of, most likely Stoic sayings or a Stoic mindset that had emerged within the Corinthian group, and their maxim, their statement was basically, all things are permitted for me, made even more emphatic by that reciprocal for me that they added. Now, what we don't necessarily realize is that Paul responds to them with an equally Stoic slogan, and I'll get into the details of that now. But just as a recap again of all the philosophy that we looked at last week, one of the paradoxes within, if you want to call it a paradox, within Stoic philosophy was this idea that it is only the wise man, only the noble-born one who is actually free. And I suppose you could say that Stoicism introduced this idea into a Hellenistic Jewish way of thinking. So if I can I'm going to run straight into some sources here in the middle panel. You can just follow with me. This is again from Diogenes Laertius. This should be from his Life of the Eminent Philosophers. Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. There it is. Okay, this is book 7 from section 125. You can follow with me there. It says, "Furthermore, the wise man," so this is referring to the Stoic idea of the wise man, "does all things well, just as we say that Ismenias plays all airs on the flute well." So this is obviously a cultural example that the philosophers now lifted. "Also, everything belongs to the wise." Now, this is a topic that we discussed many weeks ago. This way of thinking should be familiar to us now. But what I've highlighted next in yellow is the pertinent section for us. He says that for the law, they say, has conferred upon them a perfect right to all things. Now, this is his summation of the Stoic philosophy. So it gives you the idea of what was kind of the common parlance, the common way of thinking within the culture of the time. And recall that last week I emphasized the idea that this freedom that the Stoic, that the so-called wise man had, would have been culturally linked to these significant ideas of honor and status within the culture of the time. Now, what Paul does, which again wouldn't be apparent to us today because we're not embedded within this kind of cultural philosophy, but he actually responds to their maxim with an equally Stoic statement. They say, all things are permitted for me. That's their summation of the Stoic maxim. It's not just a Stoic maxim. As we discussed last week, this was a cultural ideology that kind of ran throughout the upper echelons of Greco-Roman society, but it was justified as well in a particular Stoic way of thinking. Now, Paul knows, obviously, that they have a particular Stoic mindset, and some kind of Stoic way of thinking. Maybe not a pure Stoic way of thinking, but in some sense this philosophy has crept into certain members of the community. So he addresses them as follows. He says, but not all things are of benefit. And you'll see there that I highlighted that word benefit for you there in yellow, and you can follow it there in the right hand column on Greek. But when he's replying here, in essence, Paul has resumed his argument on unity and harmony. Now you have to think back on everything that I said all the way back from chapters 1 through to 4, when he was laying down his philosophy, when he was laying down his theology. What he did is at times he used this language of what is good and proper for the harmony and the unity of the body politic, of the body as a totality, as opposed to the individual body. So the focus there, and I'm just reading from my own notes here, is that which is beneficial to the body as a whole. Again, the corporate or the political body. So he is also, in saying this, and in particular in using this word that you see here, sympheri, what he's doing is he's also adopting Stoic language, but he's adopting a different Stoic perspective in how he approaches it. So he is adopting what we would call the kinon sympheron type language, which is meaning, if we translate that from the Greek into the English, what is for common benefit or what is for common good. So it follows the notion that the universe itself, the whole of creation, if you want to think of the cosmos, for example, the whole of creation was a singular body of which all particular other elements or particular things were parts of this composite body. And we can see that this language is foremost in the Stoic mindset and the mindset of the culture at point, because he brings this to bear in chapter 12. And again, we'll get to this much later. But just to jump there for now, hear what he says here to the same group of people just a bit later in the letter. He says, for just as the body is one, and yet has many parts or facets, organs as we would understand it today, and all the parts of the body, though there are many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. Okay, so here he says in verse 14, for the body is not one part but many. So there is this tension, if you want, this philosophical tension of something that is one and yet many at the same time. But what Paul is doing, if I just jump back to our passage at hand, is their focus, if I could put it that way, is on the individual body, on the physical body. He now wants to realign their thinking in terms of the corporate body. In other words, what is good for the majority of the congregation, not necessarily society, although that may be part of it, but specifically what is important to the congregation itself. So as we saw in the previous chapters when we were dealing with these harmonia type discourses, this language occurred frequently when we had political treatises that were kind of addressed at getting the hoi polloi, the plebs, all the people back into alignment. You know, if you wanted the lower classes to come into agreement again, you know, in subjugation to the ruling elite and to certain other political classes, rather than have division, you would have these rhetoricians that had these hominia type speeches. And this is again in the same vein that he's introducing this. So as I said, essentially what the Corinthians are doing, or certain Corinthians that are arguing this thing of all things are permitted for me, their focus is on an individual bodily autonomy from within a Stoic perspective. Remember, they are getting this out of Stoicism. And I'm just going to cite here what Brookins says. This might be a good way to explain it. And I'm going to read through this carefully, and some of you might want to just go back in the recording and just re-listen to this. It is a little bit technical, but I think he explains it clearly enough. He says, this principle represented an internalization of a political idea. So the body politic now turned individual, turned inside. formulated as a solution to the problem of political and social constraints on freedom. You see, the Stoics were about freedom, but now culture and society says you can't be free in everything. And there is this ambiguity within the philosophy that needs to be resolved. So, in its Stoic formulation, the question whether one had freedom was relative to one's perspective on the relevance of outward circumstances. For the Stoics, physical and external circumstances such as health, wealth, and pleasure, and their opposites, namely death, poverty, and pain, were neither good nor evil. In other words, they saw these as neutral things. So, clarifying further, standing as it were between good and evil, these things were morally indifferent. Hence, their technical differentiation by the Stoics as indifference. So, good and evil consisted respectively only in virtue and vice, according to the Stoic philosophy. They were strictly matters of intellectual discretion. I'm not going to send you to all sorts of references for that. But the crux of this is, if true freedom consisted in free moral choice, according to the Stoic philosophy, which the body and other external circumstances could not impact. You see here, not only is it not culture that can influence your moral choice, your virtuous choice, but also your body cannot impact your virtuous choice, because by Stoic philosophy there is this separation between mind and body, and to sin is, in their thinking, has to do with the mind. It doesn't have to do with the body. And I'm trusting that you can begin to see where the particular problem within this Corinthian congregation would have developed. So anyway, getting back, I'm just going to repeat that last bit. If true freedom consisted in free moral choice, which the body and other external circumstances could not impact, there would remain no limits to freedom. The tyrant could threaten to imprison, to maim, or to kill you, and yet he did not have the power to overcome your sovereignty of moral judgment. So that was their whole perspective in terms of free will, in terms of exercising their virtue, their being, all of these ideas. Now, in contrast, Paul here is arguing, as we've obviously come to conclude now, against this kind of individualized, honor-seeking mentality that they have. This view of the body as me and mine and kind of what do I get out of it, by stating rather that they together as a group form the body of Christ. And that's the interplay here that is of particular significance. So you'll see here at the end of verse 13, he says here, and the Lord is for the body, right? In a theological sense, he is obviously for his body. But again, what Paul is doing is he's using this interplay between the body politic and the body physical, and he's reminding the Corinthians in all things that actually the physical body is of relevance. And that's why, and I just want to highlight this now, when he says here, for example, a little bit later, let me just find that particular verse I'm looking for. There we go. He says here in verse 18, obviously we dealt with this last week, flee from sexual immorality. But then he says an interesting thing. He says, every other sin that a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. So this is a statement that confused me for many years, and I couldn't understand exactly what Paul meant by this idea that that this category of sin in itself is particular because you sin against your own body. But if you now understand the Stoic perspective that he's trying to bring into this, what he's saying is that no, actually your thinking, your way of thinking that it is only the mind that can sin, it is only the realm of the soul, for example, that could sin, is incorrect, because in doing any type of fornication, you are actually sinning within your body. And yes, you can actually commit sin in the physical realm, and it is of relevance to your relationship with God. Why? Because your body belongs to Him, in effect. And that is why He says there, the Lord is for the body, just as the body is for the Lord. So that's just to show you how these kind of ideas tie in together. Now, it is possible that Paul could have the book of Sirach in the back of his mind here. I don't know, but there is an interesting part here that I would just like to show us. Now, this is obviously extra-canonical literature, but this is from the Apocrypha of the Old Testament. So I think some of the Bible translations, maybe the Old King James and some of the Catholic Bibles may even have included this within their canon. But Sirach here says very interestingly, and I'm going to read here from verse 27, the author says, "My son, prove thy soul in thy life, and see that what harmeth it thou give it not." Okay, in modern parlance or modern English, don't give to your soul what is not of benefit to it, what is going to harm it. And then he says here a very interesting statement, "For not everything is good for everyone." And this seems to be a very similar language to what Paul is saying here. He says, not all things are of benefit. Now, in terms of Sirach, the context there is actually indulging in food, and it has to do with gluttony and the types of food that are eaten and whether one should indulge in these things or not, as was the cultural practice of the day. I'm sure many of you have heard of these Roman feasts that they would have had in Rome itself, where people were invited to these lavish, huge banquets, and the idea was to eat as much as you possibly can, and then they would go out into a corridor and they would throw up and they would come back and they would start the whole process over again, because part of the culture, I suppose, part of the idea was to see how if I invite people, how exquisite of a banquet can I present to the people, because that is part of where my status is tied to, is this wealth, this lavishness and everything else. But the other part of the excess, of course, comes from this cultural maxim of all things are permitted for me. And if I am of the higher echelon, if I am this person of status, right, then I should indulge in these things to show precisely how free I am. To us today, it might seem like a little bit of a warped mindset, but it's interesting to me that you can find a philosophical justification for this kind of hedonism that was within the Roman culture. Now, just as an aside, as I have been asked this by students in the past, what I described there, this kind of this excessive banquet, this overindulging in food, everything else, this is what in the culture of the day would have been referred to as an orgy. So when we talk about a Roman orgy, that's actually what we have in mind. And I know that a long while back, I actually used the term in church, and I got a bit lambasted about it because everybody thought that I was referring to some kind of sexually perverse intercourse that a group of people were planning to have together, and that was the furthest thing from my mind. I was thinking of the term orgy not in the sense that we would use it today in the sense of a sexual perversion, but specifically in the sense that it would have been used in Roman society of the day, where an orgy referred to one of these excessive eating banquets, for lack of a better way to describe it. Now, as you'll come to see as we go through the texts and the history this evening, obviously sexual perversion was part and parcel of this kind of banquet, but that wasn't necessarily the focus of it. But anyway, so to get back to Sirach here, so the author says not everything is good for everyone. He says that every soul makes not its choice of every kind. Indulge not excess in enjoyment, nor immoderation in any dainties. What he's basically saying in all of this, and I do apologize, this is quite old English, but it's the only translation that I have available on my system here. But what he's basically saying is, if you know that a particular food is not good for you, don't overindulge in it. Now, Paul may have this particular verse in mind, but he's not thinking about it in a purely physical sense. He is thinking about it in the sense of what benefits the body. So to give you more context there, in the non-physical sense, if I could put it that way, let's just go here. This is from Cicero's De Officiis, and basically he says here, reading from 185, says, those who propose to take charge of the affairs of government should not fail to remember two of Plato's rules. First, to keep the good of the people so clearly in view that regardless of their own interests, they will make their every action conform to that. And second, he says, to care for the welfare of the whole body politic. Do you see the language coming through here? Even in Cicero's writing, it says to care for the welfare of the whole body politic, and not in serving the interests of some one party to betray the rest. So the idea is that if you are in this noble position, that you are in government, that you are accountable to others, the focus is no longer on you. The focus is, what can I do to the benefit of others, despite what might be of benefit to me? And it would seem to me that it is in this context of the language of the body politic that Paul is trying to bring his argument across. So there is a possibility, and obviously there's no way that I can prove this because I don't have a direct link into Paul's mind when he wrote this. But it is possible that Paul elected to use this word sympheron, what we translate here as profitable or beneficial in the translation here, that he chose that word sympheron specifically when he engaged with the Corinthian church because of their Stoic prejudice, their underlying philosophy. He uses language and key terms that would have been very familiar to them because it's the kind of terminology that they would have used. Now, what's interesting in this regard is that outside of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, this word occurs in only one place in the entire New Testament, and that is in the book of Hebrews chapter 12 verse 10. So that's the only other place that any other New Testament author potentially used this term. But again, I should caution you here in terms of how we interpret these things. A lack of, an argument from the absence of something to me is always a little bit sketchy, because an argument for an absence is difficult to sustain. Just because somebody doesn't talk about it doesn't mean that, again, as we said a couple of weeks back, doesn't mean that they don't have a concept of it, doesn't mean that it might not have been there. It just means that it may not have occurred in that particular letter at that particular moment. So again, I find it very interesting that he uses this language specifically when addressing the Corinthians and in no other epistles that we have a record of. But remember, we don't have record of all his writing. So that to me is not an exclusive proof of anything. Now, Sirach's emphasis on gluttony here and on what we eat and what we choose to eat, it gives us a nice segue into verse 13 here, which is where he starts with another one of their statements. This is another one of the Corinthian statements. They say, food is for the stomach, and the stomach is for food. Now, what's interesting here is that what we realize at this point is that we're starting to get the first hints rather directly put forth. Now, it's not we're no longer inferring kind of between the lines what their theology might be. We're now getting a rather direct quotation that would suggest that the Corinthians clearly denied the survival of the physical body in the afterlife. That was their philosophy, and that is why, again, in chapter 15, Paul is going to have to expound again on this entire theory of the resurrection, that it is actually a resurrection of the physical body as well, and again emphasizing that the physical body is significant. But here we have evidence that in there saying food is for the stomach is for food, we now have more concrete evidence of this idea that they viewed the body as something that would be discarded and as something that is of no relevance. So the Corinthians then used this idea to ground their indifference in terms of, dietary choices and in terms of sexual intercourse. Because if the body is irrelevant, then I can eat what I want, I can sleep with whom I want, as long as I don't sin in my mind or in the realm of my soul, then I'm okay. Now, jumping towards this last bit of the verse, where he says here sexual immorality, and we should all know by now that that is the Greek word porneia that is being used there. But a lot of commentators, when they look at this word here, they interpret this term porneia or sexual immorality specifically in terms of verse 16, because Paul later clarifies for us. He says, or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? And maybe I should just highlight that section for us there. But a lot of commentaries argue that this here is the context for the word porneia. And their argument is clearly that what was happening is that people within this community were engaging in the common practice of going out and engaging with prostitutes, sleeping with prostitutes, etc. So one such example is from the commentary of Gordon Fee, and I'm just going to read here what he says on the point. He says here, at the conclusion of the first paragraph, now this is verses 15 to 17, Paul argues that one may not take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute, implying that this is the specific expression of porneia with which Paul is here dealing. So remember last week and the week before I said to you that this word porneia is kind of a blanket term for any kind of sexual immorality, and I threw it out there as a suggestion that we start with this generalized term and then we get specific incidences. What I want to do this evening is show you that there is actually a particular linkage to this word, and there's a particular context to this fornication, to this porneia, that Paul would have had in mind. But I don't think that it is necessarily going out and sleeping with prostitutes in the sense that we would think of it today. The assumption of the majority of commenters in this is that the Corinthians would have thought that being people of the Spirit, that this implies that they've moved to this higher plane. Remember, they had this warped sense of eschatology, that they are now in the realm of the Spirit, that they are super spiritual, that they are more spiritual. Remember, these are the ones who can speak in tongues and prophesy and do everything else. So they're up there. You see, another culture marker, another status marker. And they were obviously unaffected by any behavior that has to do merely with the body. So Fee's arguments, and I'm not harping on him because I have any particular issue with him, I'm just citing him as an example. I actually really enjoy his commentary. I agree with a lot of what he says. It's just that in this point, I think that we may need to be a little bit more specific. But he argues, for example, at the conclusion that food and intercourse, that these two topics, that they seem to be rather contrary topics, are related to one another in the following way. And I'm just going to cite him again. He says, the matter of food, therefore, is not the issue here at all. Rather, he says, it is intended to set up the issue of the body and sexual immorality. So in other words, what Fee is saying is that he's using this maxim of food is for the stomach to get to the issue of sexual perversity. So again, to paraphrase his argument, if food represents the fleshly nature, and if indulgence in food is a metonym or a metaphor for what is wrong, then by extension, I could have said the body is for fornication and fornication is for the body. But that's not the statement that they had. They had the statement food is for the stomach, and that's why he used it. Now, again, if we understand the Greco-Roman culture of Corinth, I can understand why a lot of commentators came to this conclusion, because frequenting prostitutes was not only common, but it was also accepted within Roman societies. And Corinth, and I can't remember if we did this way back when I gave you an introduction to the city, to its context, to the history of it and everything else, but Corinth was notorious for its lascivious way of life, its lascivious living. And among the Greeks of the city of Corinth, there was even within their own Greek culture, there was an idiom that they had for engaging in prostitution. When they went out and they wanted to say, well, I'm going to go and, hire a prostitute or engage with a prostitute, they would literally say, Corinthiazome, which means I Corinthianize. So do you see how this metonymic slip has happened? That Corinthian now becomes a substitute for sleeping with a prostitute. So just to give you an example of how prominent this was, even somebody like Plato, when he wrote his Republic, he says the following, and I'm hoping that I've got the right one here. Yeah, okay. There we go. So you can just see where my mouse is there. And he's right, so he says, you would frown then on a little Corinthian maid as the chère amie of men who were to keep themselves fit. Now, obviously, this is a question, and the answer there is most certainly. But it's interesting that within the dialogue that Plato records here in the Republic, do you see that instead of saying, so you would frown then on engaging with a prostitute, he simply calls the prostitute a little Corinthian. You see how the two terms are idiomatically completely interchangeable. That is the degree of perversity that was within the Corinthian society. So again, I understand exactly where this comes from. And part of the problem in this is that I think a lot of people were influenced by Strabo's geography. And I'm going to jump there. Let us just read a significant portion from this. I'm hoping this is it. Yeah, okay, now I'm looking for 8:6:12. There we go. There come my highlights. So if you just want to read with me there, where I've highlighted in yellow in the middle panel, Strabo records, and the temple of Aphrodite. Now, this was the Greek equivalent of Venus, and I'll get into those details just now. But the temple of Aphrodite was so rich that it owned more than 1,000 temple slaves, courtesans, in other words, temple prostitutes, whom both men and women had dedicated to the goddess. And therefore it was also on account of these women that the city was crowded with people and grew rich. For instance, the ship captains freely squandered their money, and hence the proverb, "Not for every man is the voyage to Corinth." Okay, so that was Strabo's recording, and or record, I should say. And because of his account here, a lot of historians, a lot of commentators have, I think, incorrectly assumed that what Paul may be dealing with here in 1 Corinthians 6, from 12 to 20, is an issue of members of the believing congregation going out and engaging potentially with temple prostitutes, or at least with any kind of prostitute. Now, the problem with this is that Strabo's recording here actually refers to the Greek city of Corinth before it was destroyed. If you can remember, it was destroyed, I think, around about 146 BC or thereabouts. And then in the time of Julius Caesar, it was actually rebuilt. I think that was around about 44, 45 BC. And it was rebuilt as a Roman city. So it still would have had Greek citizens, but a lot of Roman citizens. And it became a colony of Rome. And obviously that meant that there was a philosophical shift, there was a cultural shift within the city. Whatever was rebuilt in Corinth, there is no historical record of a temple to Aphrodite that was in any sense large enough to accommodate that amount of prostitutes, never mind other people that were serving. So it would seem that Strabo's recording here, or record here, is in reference to the old Corinth, the Corinth that was actually destroyed by the Romans before it was rebuilt. So Roman Corinth, as far as we know, only had a small, or relative to this one, a smaller temple that was dedicated to Aphrodite, and which would not have been able, as I said, to house that many courtesans. Now, the second problem with this account is that by the time that Corinth had been rebuilt, culturally speaking, Aphrodite, the Greek goddess, or think of her almost as a sex symbol within the Greek pantheon, would have become the Roman goddess Venus. And Venus, at this time, within the culture, was venerated kind of as the mother of the imperial family. That would have been her title. So there's sufficient documentation. We have enough historical documents. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words here, but we have enough documents that would disclose that the Corinthians frequently had this obsession with an imperial cult. So if they had an obsession with the imperial cult, what it means in my mind is that they would have venerated Venus not as a sex symbol, but as the mother of the imperial family. And it is unlikely, therefore, that temple prostitution would be the correct situation for interpreting what is going on here in 1 Corinthians. So according to O'Connor, now he wrote a book on St. Paul's Corinth in which he analyzes the architecture, the history, everything of relevance to what would have been happening in 1st century AD Corinth. He says the following. He says, sacred prostitution was never a Greek custom. So despite what the influence that Strabo's writing here has had on academics, and had for many decades, if not many centuries potentially, he actually says here quite clearly that sacred prostitution was never a Greek custom. It may have been a custom in other parts of the world, but not necessarily in Greece. And even if Corinth were an exception, this is his argument, even if it were an exception, the silence of every other ancient author on this matter would be difficult to explain. Why is Strabo the only historical source that we have about so-called temple prostitution in Corinth? Nobody else records it. It's not saying that there wasn't prostitution, but the specific cult prostitution is not mentioned by anyone. So he concludes the following. He says, what appears to have happened is that Strabo combined elements from a number of different sources to produce a totally distorted picture. That's the best conclusion that I can leave you with at this stage. And again, it's important because I think a lot of times, whether we're studying theology or Bible school or whatever, this idea of cult prostitution has always kind of been foremost in the mind of a lot of academics, and it's something that we need to kind of get away from, and we have been getting away from in the last couple of decades. But anyway, in contrast, there is a situational context that we can look at here, and I want to just cite another academic here, Booth, on this. He says it is conceivable that this maxim that they had, this, let me just go back up on your screen here, this one where they said all things are permitted for me. It is conceivable that this maxim, all things are permitted, concerned the notorious conduct of the Corinthians, or specifically the Corinthian Christians, at dinners, concerning the intimate and unholy trinity of eating, drinking, and sexual immorality. So what he's saying is the context here of fornication specifically doesn't have to do with prostitutes in the sense of I'm going out to get a prostitute, to sleep with a prostitute. It has to do specifically with the kind of fornication that would have happened within the setting of these huge social dinners, these social events. And this is the view that Bruce Winter also takes. And while you would have realized when we were dealing with chapters 1 through 4 that I didn't necessarily always agree with his take on the philosophical framework of the rhetoricians being the chief concern that Paul had with wisdom in Corinth, I do like his take on the Sitz im Leben, on the cultural context of Corinth at this point. He explains it as follows. He says that evidence from Plutarch's Moralia, and I don't have that on the screen that I can share with you, but I'm just going to quote what he says here. He says, it shows that gluttony and sexual indulgence at dinners could be linked together. Specifically, Philo of Alexandria recorded that special tables were reserved for the drinking bouts, which followed as part of, but not the only event in the after dinners. So in other words, the after parties, this is the big problem that Paul has and that he needs to address. So I just want to jump over to another source, assuming that the software will allow me. I think this is, yeah, I'm assuming this is the last one in the column. But this is a record from Philo. Now, this is obviously a Hellenistic Jew, but it's interesting what he writes here. He says 7 tables at the least. Now, he's describing the kind of excessive banquets that they had. He says 7 tables at least, and even more, are brought in, covered with the flesh of every creature that land, sea, and river or air produce, beast, fish, or bird, all choice and in fine condition, each table differing in the dishes served and the method of seasoning, and that nothing to be found in nature should be unrepresented. The last tables brought in are loaded with fruits, not including those reserved for the drinking bouts and the after dinners, as they call them. Then, while some tables are taken out to be emptied by the gluttony of the company who gorge themselves like cormorants, interesting visual metaphor there, this idea of these birds that kind of swallow the food whole. He says, so voraciously that they nibble even at the bones, while other tables have the dishes mangled and torn and left half eaten. And when they are quite exhausted, their bellies crammed up to the gullets, but their lust still ravenous. Impotent for eating, they turn to drink. Okay. So do you see here, vice number 1 has now moved to vice number 2. We started with gluttony, now we've moved on to excessive drink. And it is interesting here, he points out a little bit later, he says, these particular kinds of parties, orgies, dinners, whatever you want to call them, that these were deserved to be remembered was the judgment of men whose character and discourses showed them to be philosophers. Now, he namely cites Xenophon and Plato. But he said who described them, these two authors, as worthy to be recorded, surmising that they would serve to posterity as models of the happily conducted banquet. Now, I read you that just to give you some introduction into the next bit here. I find it very interesting what Philo records here, and why I find it interesting is, unless I've missed it, I haven't found another commentary on what we're dealing with in 1 Corinthians that actually notes this particular emphasis. But again, note what is recorded here. It says, in Plato's banquet, now this is obviously the one that Plato is referring to in his writings, the talk is almost entirely concerned with love, not merely with the love sickness of men for women or women for men, passions recognized by laws of nature, but of men for other males, differing from them only in age. For if we find some clever subtlety dealing apparently with a heavenly love and Aphrodite, it is brought in to give a touch of humor. And then the next part that I marked for you there in green. The chief part is taken up by the common vulgar love, which robs men of the courage, which is the virtue most valuable for the life both of peace and war, sets up the disease of effeminacy in their souls, and turns into a hybrid of man and women, those who should have been disciplined in all the practices which make for valor. So again, Philo's critique here of the effeminate man, of pederasty and all of that. But why this is interesting for me is it introduces at least the possibility. I'm not going to use this as exclusive proof. This isn't something that I've written a paper on or done extensive academic research on, but it's interesting for me because it posits the idea, at least, that not only did they engage with fornication after these meals, and I'll get to the evidence for that now, but that love or fornication, however you want to call it, eros or pornos or porneia, was pretty much the topic of the feast, of the idea, at least within the Grecian part of the culture. How far that extended to the Roman culture, I don't know. I can't say. But why it's important for me is particularly because if we go back to this list of vices that Paul mentions here, he said here, do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, in other words, the fornicators, let's make it specific now, the fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals. And remember, that's a combination of two words, meaning passive and active homosexual partners. None of these will inherit the kingdom of God. So if this is something that was happening in the time that 1 Corinthians was written, or at least was commonly known, and I assume commonly practiced, then it gives me some context for why Paul may have decided to introduce these two specific terms within this list of vices. And I'm going to conclude this evening by re-looking at this list and showing you how all of this links to the banquet and to their habit of bringing one another to court. That all of those terms can basically be derived from that. That I don't believe, I'll say it again, that I'm of the opinion, at least, that Paul doesn't just take an arbitrary list of vices here, that he is specifically singling out things that would have been issues within the culture that he is referring to, that he's not just pulling some stoic trick and saying, oh, here's a list of things, you know. So given that, again, as I said, this is why it's interesting to me to read a little bit of history like this, because it gives me some kind of framework that I can begin to understand, okay, this is potentially what Paul was dealing with and why he had to approach things in this way. So again, if you look at 59 and 60 here of Philo's contemplative life, it's, as I said, pederasty is the topic of discussion of this after dinner party. And even though, as I said, the philosophical discussions may have been more Greek than Roman, and I'm not exactly sure where the boundary marker is of this cultural influence in terms of the Corinthian church or even in terms of the Corinthian society at this stage, but it suggests to me that there is a potential reason why Paul would include these two terms on homosexuality. Now, to get back to the topic, Dio Chrysostom noted that traveling brothels could have been imported by hosts to cater for guests, specifically at these grand dinners, in which case he's referring now to a series of banquets that would have been given by the president, for example, of the Isthmian Games. Now, this is a set of games that was held, it was basically second in importance only to the Olympic Games. And that when this was inaugurated and then when it was celebrated every couple of years, what would happen is that the president would host a set of banquets for the Corinthian citizens. Now, note the word citizens here. You had to be a Roman citizen of Corinth to be invited to this thing. And I want you to keep this idea in the back of your mind, because the idea that they had a set of banquets that was celebrated at the temple of Poseidon, and to which prostitutes would have been invited as good company for the guests, may go a long way into explaining not just what we're dealing with here in 1 Corinthians 6, but may also explain why Paul has to deal with the issue of meat offered to idols at length later on in the book. Because the same people that were potentially saying, well, I am of higher status, I should be free to do what I want, and the privileges that my status as a citizen of Rome affords me to have, imagine you're one of these important people in the church and you've now been invited to a celebration such as this. It is not only a huge honor for you to be there, but I suppose that it may be frowned upon if you were to decline the invitation. So all of this kind of stuff is running in the historical background of the letter that we're dealing with. And it seems likely to me that part of the problem in this issue of idolatry that we see here, in this issue of fornication, all of these have to do with these elaborate banquets. And they were social requirements. It was very difficult to just kind of, worm your way out of these things. So what should be noted here, if we just do a little bit of sleuthing, if I could call it that, if I go down and I look at verse 16, right? Paul says here, or do you not know that the one who joins himself to a prostitute is one body with her? For he says, and now he cites scripture directly, and the citation comes from Genesis 2:24. He says, the two shall become one flesh. Now, this is interesting for me because his citation of Genesis 2:24 means that he chose not to cite any other Old Testament scripture that has to do specifically with adultery. And you may be wondering why I'm hammering on this point. The point that I'm trying to make is this, that rather than just seeing here this idea of, let me go back up to this list that we have here. Rather than seeing this idea of sexual immorality as any kind of immorality, or of the issue of married men going and sleeping with prostitutes and thereby, in the biblical sense, maybe not in the cultural sense, but in the biblical sense, committing adultery in so doing, the fact that he doesn't address adultery per se would suggest that the kind of fornication or the kind of porneia that Paul has in mind here has to do specifically with a class of citizen, a class of gentlemen that are not yet married. And this is the argument that Winter presents, and I want to flesh it out a little bit. Again, don't have absolute proof for this, but it seems to me the most likely scenario that we're dealing with. So, again, as I said, rather than see this term porneia or fornication as a blanket term, right, we are seeing it as something that deals specifically with unmarried men having sexual intercourse before they get married. So Winter says it as follows. He says, the problem which confronted Paul concerns young men reaching the age of reclining, when promiscuity was theirs both by choice and by convention. The accusation he brings against them is that they are committing specifically fornication and not adultery per se. So, to give you a little bit of an elaboration here, in Roman society, there was a specific rite of passage that they had. They had a celebration where young men would don a new toga, which they called the toga virilis. And this toga virilis, which you may also know as the toga pura or the toga alba obviously from white, so this was a plain off-white type of garment that was worn by male Roman citizens in particular when they reached adulthood. Now, it symbolized the transition from boyhood to manhood and the assumption of civic responsibilities within Roman society. That's why it was significant for them. The toga virilis was typically conferred to the youth when he became a man at a public ceremony, usually around about the age of 16. Sources do vary on this. I have sources that say 14 to 16. I have others that say 18. But the general consensus seems to be around 16 years of age, depending on, I'm guessing, where they would fall within the spectrum of a particular festival called the Liberalia Festival, which always happened on March the 17th, which was associated with the god Liber, a deity linked to freedom and to fertility. Do you see the language here again? This idea that we have here in verse 12 of all things are permitted for me is specifically embodied, emblazoned, if you want, in this worship of what was the deity's name? Liber, the god of freedom. Now, this is obviously where we get the English term liberty from the Latin liber. So the act of donning this garment, this toga virilis, it marked the gentleman's legal and social transition into adulthood. It granted on him new responsibilities, such as the ability to participate in public life, to attend the comitia, in other words, the assemblies of the citizens, and eventually to serve in the military. Now, according to Booth, he says that there were certain conventions attached to this donning of the toga virilis, one of which was the license to freely participate in the symposium and convivium, and the license to accept invitations there to recline at these symposia, at these gala events, these huge dinners. So think of it in the same sense that I suppose, I don't know if it's as prominent in our culture, but I get the impression that it's very, very prominent in American culture, that when one goes to university, there is this rite of passage, that there's almost this social moratorium, or the lifting of the moratorium, I should say, that grants students this brief interlude, this brief time in their lives where they can now indulge in excessive drinking and revelry, and so on. It's kind of expected as par for the course if you're a university student. Not to say that everybody has to indulge in it, but what I'm saying is the culture generally doesn't frown upon it because it's kind of seen as this rite of passage almost. Now, we have the same kind of situation 2,000 years ago in the Greco-Roman society, specifically the Roman aspect of the society, because what it signified is that when you now have this code, you are now invited to these meals, you can now partake not just in the meal, but partake of the sexual gratification through the ladies or the prostitutes that would have been there as well. That's why we have a record of somebody like Tacitus, for example, writing the following, that he says, "The elegant banquet, along with the use of the toga, are the enticements of Romanization to vice and to servitude." And Plutarch makes another remark here. He says, as they, these young men, these gentlemen, as they lay aside the garb of childhood, straight away they become full of unruliness. You see, there was this expectation within culture, oh, well, now they're going to indulge in the food and the drink and the fornication, because this is what society now affords to them. And that's why Winter recalls the following. He says, in Athens, when the new adult, in his view here, aged 18, but I'm going to go with 16, which is what the majority of my sources say, usually acquired the right to accept invitations to recline. Now, obviously by that word recline, we mean to recline at table to engage with the meal, right? He was considered sufficiently mature to cope with sexual advances. So the idea was that you are now an adult, you can now deal with these things, so we are going to throw you to the wolves, so to say. You are now of sufficient stature, of sufficient maturity to be able to make the correct decision with regards to these matters. So having said all this, having given you the historical context behind what may have been going on here, if we now return to this list here, and there are 10 items. Now again, the NASB will list 9 because there's 2 terms that are brought together in this one term, homosexual, here. But if we look at this list of terms, you'll see now why I say it looks to me all the less random and all the more planned why Paul mentions these specific things. So the idea, firstly, he focuses on sexual immorality. The fornicators may relate, as I said, to these societal dinner indulgences, and they may be a potential connotation behind 7 verse 9. So let me just jump down to 7 verse 9. We will get there shortly. But for now, let's just look ahead. He says here, but if they do not have self-control, these are the unmarried gentlemen, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. That is his concession for unmarried men. And that, again, it may be these dinners that are in the back of his mind here. The second term, idolaters. Let me go back up there, sorry. The second term here, idolaters. There's 2 ways that this could enter the list of descriptions. Firstly is, as I suggested last week, that all of this emphasis on myself is a form of idolatry, that we are worshipping the self, the body, gratification, in whatever form it takes, above God, right? That every one of these things that he is listing as a vice is a result, I should say, of a type of idolatry that places me, my sense of morality, everything else, above God. But it could also be that he has idolaters in mind here because he's thinking of these public ceremonial dinners, particularly, as I said, the kind that would have been held in honor of the Isthmian Games at the Temple of Poseidon, and then quite clearly the kind of food that would have been offered to idolaters, or at least, sorry, the food would have been offered to idols, and that's where the line needs to be drawn. So the next term here, adulterers, is something that he will address in 7 verse 2. Let me just scroll down there. But he says here, but because of sexual immoralities, because of porneia, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. That is his ruling, and it is the ruling of the Lord as well. This is not Paul on his own. He didn't create a new doctrine here. But his ruling is related to this idea that adultery, no matter what Roman society may say on the matter, that any form of adultery is unacceptable in the eyes of God. Now, again, I did some research in regards to these other terms here, the 2 terms related to homosexuals. Last week or the week before, I suggested that the rules may have been different for Roman citizens and non-citizens, and I went and I had a look at that for you, and I just want to give you a little bit of an update on that. So the point is that actually for a Roman citizen, it was legal for a Roman citizen, if we're thinking in terms of homosexuality now, to penetrate or potentially even rape a non-Roman. In other words, a person who was not free, who was not a citizen. In other words, specifically a slave here. But it was never legal for a non-citizen to be the active partner in the relationship. And this is because slaves were considered res, or property, rather than personae, or persons, under Roman law. So it meant that their bodies were subject to their owner's control. Now, just to give an example of why this, it seems weird to us, but how this sort of worked in the Roman society is I could sleep with my own slave. His or her body was my property. I couldn't necessarily just go and sleep with anybody's slave because that slave is not my property. I would have to then be offered or granted permission, I should say, by the owner to make use of his property, as disgusting as that idea would seem to us today. So in terms not only of homosexual relationships, which he mentions here, but also in terms of adultery, which was, again, not as severely frowned upon in Greco-Roman society as it would have been under Hellenistic Jewish society, and in terms of engaging with any kind of fornication or actually actively going out and seeking prostitutes to engage with, all of these things would have been legal within the Roman system. So And again, a part of, I think, what is difficult for us is understanding the Roman legal system in terms of what is property and what is a person. In other words, our concept, what I'm trying to say in a rather clumsy fashion, I suppose, this evening, is our concept of human rights, our concept of human value and human dignity, even in the biblical sense, is not the same kind of value that the Romans would have seen in terms of life. Not all life was equal. The life of a slave was not equal to that of a freed man. That is the reality under which they lived. Now, before I carry on this, moving abruptly to the next ones, we have thieves, we have the greedy, we have the habitually drunk, we have verbal abusers, and we have swindlers. Now, thieves, greedy, and swindlers, again, are not there by accident. I believe that they come in from the context of Paul's argument in chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. If you can recall back when we did that, this was all the liturgical issues with members of the culture, or of the society, engaging in legal complaints with one another. So you can see that all those terms, thieves, greedy, swindlers, would be covered under that. And then the other term we have here, habitually drunk, as you should have gathered from this evening, that now makes a lot of sense, because if we're having these huge dinner parties, excessive drinking would have been part of this symposium or this get-together of people. And then the last one here, the only one that might be a little bit odd, is this verbal abusers here. Now, without any direct context, I can't really say what Paul had in mind here, although I'm just going to add this as my 10 cents worth. Given the Corinthians' treatment of one another, and if this wasn't apparent in chapter 6, verses 1 to 8, in terms of them taking their brothers to court, if that wasn't apparent enough, you'll see by the time that we reach chapter 10 that their treatment of the so-called lower class Corinthian citizens was basically to disassociate from them completely, that they didn't even want to share a communion meal with these people. If that's your kind of attitude towards your fellow church congregant, then it makes sense to me that verbal abuse may have been part of this entire package, but I don't have a direct context to you. So aside from this one term, verbal abusers, which I can't give you an absolute on, it would seem to me, again, that every single term that is mentioned here can be related either to what is preceded in chapters 5 and 6, or what is now addressed in the last part of chapter 6 and what is coming in chapter 7. So again, there's a very deliberate way in which Paul approaches his argument in this. Now, I'm going to conclude this pericope next week by looking at the specific theological and spiritual implications of all of this. But I want to close the discussion for this evening here. I know that I haven't given us much application in terms of what we can take away from this as Christians today. I'm going to bring that in next week, so please bear with me. I think there's been more than enough history and everything else that we've had to engage with. But I hope that this has given you a little bit more understanding into the kind of culture that Paul had to deal with. And I think, again, that it doesn't take a huge leap for us to apply what's happening here into our present context. We still do many of the same things today. A lot of our secular society shares a lot of these viewpoints. And I've said this before, but I will say it again, that a lot of us Christians view what is happening in Western society today, this emergence of the sexual revolution in the last couple of decades, this, especially the strengthening of the LGBTQ movement within the last decade or two, this fight for so-called trans rights and equality and all of these things. It may seem like this is something that comes completely out of the blue, that this is a totally new thing, within Western society today. But actually, if you look back on history, you'll see that the actual oddity has been, for the majority of our history, has been the more puritanical, the more restrained sexual practices that were introduced into culture because Christian values became the predominant idea within Western society. Now, obviously, with the kind of cultural revolution that's happened, with a lot of people having fallen away from the church. Now again, please don't take this as a completely negative statement. I think there's a lot of evidence even today amongst celebrities, amongst American culture within Europe, that I can see that there are a lot of people that are very close to the cusp of handing their lives over to Christ, of willingly giving their lives in submission to Him. So I'm not saying this as some kind of doomsday statement that the church is in deterioration and it's falling away and it will never be the same again. Please don't hear that in what I'm saying. What I am trying to say is that within a culture where the church doesn't have the predominant cultural voice that it used to have, that what we're experiencing now is actually just a reversion back to what was the norm 2,000 years ago, that would have been the norm not just within Greco-Roman society, but in a number of societies. You can look back at the horrendous practices of the Canaanites in the Old Testament, for example. Now, they did it even worse. They had child sacrifice. They had all these kinds of things that even the Roman citizens would have thought is an abomination. But again, in my very roundabout way this evening, all I really want to emphasize is that we as a culture of Christians, we as the children of God, are called to live to His standard, to embody His standard, no matter what the culture around us might say. This is the problem that the Corinthians faced, and it is the problem that some of us are going to face today. The question is, are we going to bow the knee and say, well, you know what, actually God has it all wrong, and clearly Paul was out of his mind when he wrote this stuff. He must have been completely sexist, he must have been completely racist, he must have been pro-slavery, or he never was any of those things. But if we choose to misinterpret or misread the scriptures, we can misread them in that way. And the question is, are we going to bend the knee to what is now kind of the norm in society, this questioning of the authority of God's word, or more specifically, the authority of God's morality over us? Are we going to bend to that kind of secular agenda, or are we going to stand firm in our beliefs, in that which God has called us to be, in the truth that God has called us to stand for? It's a question that is at some stage going to hit each and every one of us. Some maybe more directly than others. I have to engage with this all the time, because every time I present a teaching and it goes online and it's out there for people to see, I am aware of the fact that there may be a cultural backlash. I am aware of the fact that there may be ramifications and consequences to some of the things that I'm saying this evening. But I cannot go and make the Word of God say what I want it to say, just to make myself feel better, or just to make someone else feel better. Right? I don't go out of my way to offend people, but unfortunately, if the truth offends you, there is nothing much I can do about that. You have a choice to either accept that truth, to either accept that maybe some of the things that I thought were okay are actually not okay. Maybe they are sin. Maybe God does classify and categorize certain ways of living, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of doing. Maybe God does classify these things as sin. And I then need to come to the place where I am willing to submit to God's word and to agree with what He says on the matter, as opposed to what I would like, as opposed to, again, my individual autonomy. And that is the debate that was, not a debate, but that was the issue that was rising within the Corinthian congregation, or had been for quite some time, and needed to be addressed by Paul. And again, same thing for us today, maybe slightly different circumstances, but I don't think that much. And each of us is going to have to choose, am I going to stand honestly for what the Word of God says, or am I going to twist the Word of God so that I can conform it to the mold of a secular agenda? And unfortunately, all the evidence that I have, that I've seen, is that when churches choose to do that, the moment they go onto a secular agenda, the moment they start to question the inerrancy and the authority of the Word of God, inevitably those churches are headed towards self-destruction because they've removed the foundation from underneath themselves. So it's like a trap. It looks good. We think, oh, we're going to bring lots of people into our church. We're going to be seeker-friendly. We're going to be available to all the people that have questions, that used to be offended with Christianity. We're going to be open and available to them. We're going to tell them that we love you no matter what. And we're not going to confront you with the issue of sin, because that might just chase you away. And the problem is, the moment you do that, you're actually no longer a church. You may be a social gathering, but you're not technically a church anymore. And it comes as no surprise that for a lot of those churches, they end up going into ruin and destruction because the members aren't getting from the church what they need to get. So anyway, that's my diatribe finished for the evening. I'm going to leave it there. As I said, and next week we can look at detail at some of the theological and spiritual implications of this whole dialogue for us as Christians. Right. May the blessing of the Lord be with you this evening. I thank you all that you tuned in, and I hope you have a wonderful week ahead. And I am going to switch over to my students and my members in the Zoom chat and just hear if they have anything that they want to add.